Hey, what's up, everyone? If you're here for stories that remind you why human connection matters, stories that make you believe in second chances and unexpected moments that change everything, then you've found your home. This is Real Life Chronicles, where ordinary moments become extraordinary memories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought a broken shower would change my entire perspective on life, love, and what it means to truly see someone. But then again, the best stories always start with the most ordinary moments, don't they? It was a Thursday morning in late September when the call came through. Rain was drumming against the windows of my small office above Martinez Hardware Store in downtown Riverside, Oregon, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee while trying to make sense of invoices that seemed to multiply overnight. The phone rang with that sharp, demanding tone that always made me think someone's day was about to get worse. Northwest Plumbing Solutions. This is Jake speaking. Hi, I'm hoping you can help me. The voice was soft, but carried an undertone. A frustration that I recognized immediately. It was the sound of someone who'd been dealing with a problem longer than they should have. My shower has been acting up for weeks, and this morning, it just completely gave up on me. Water everywhere, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I grabbed my appointment book, already mentally cataloging the tools I'd need. What's your address, ma'am? I can be there within the hour. Sarah Mitchell, 1847 Cedar Lane. And thank you, really. You're a lifesaver. Cedar Lane was one of those quiet suburban streets where every house told a story of families that had grown up, moved on, or settled into comfortable routines. Mature oak trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves just beginning to hint at autumn. Colors in the houses were the kind of solid, unpretentious homes that spoke of practical dreams rather than grand ambitions. I pulled into the driveway of 1847, two-story colonial with blue shutters and a front porch that looked like it had hosted countless summer evenings. My van looked conspicuously utilitarian next to the carefully maintained garden beds and the small sedan parked under a carport that had seen better decades. I've been running Northwest Plumbing Solutions for almost 4 years now, ever since I'd moved to Riverside with nothing but a pickup truck full of tools and a determination to start fresh. At 32, I'd already learned that people called plumbers when their world was falling apart in very specific, very wet ways, and they needed someone who could fix things without making them feel stupid about whatever had gone wrong. The woman who answered the door wasn't what I'd expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. Sarah Mitchell was probably in her mid-40s, with shoulder-length auburn hair that looked like she'd been running her hands through it and eyes the color of winter pine trees. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater that had seen some years, and there was something about the way she carried herself that suggested she was used to handling things on her own. "You must be Jake," she said, stepping back to let me in. "I'm Sarah, thank you for coming so quickly." "No problem at all." "Lead the way to the crime scene." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that made me think she didn't do it often enough. Crime scene. I like that. Oh, I think this was more of a natural disaster. The house felt lived in the best possible way. There were books stacked on side tables, a coffee mug abandoned on the kitchen counter, and family photos scattered on the mantelpiece in that casual way that suggested they'd been placed by someone who looked at them often. It wasn't magazine perfect, but it was real. And there was something comforting about that. "The bathroom's upstairs," Sarah said, gesturing toward a staircase with a banister that had been polished smooth by years of hands. "Fair warning, it's not pretty up there." She wasn't kidding. The upstairs bathroom looked like a small flood had occurred. Towels were scattered across the floor, soaking up water that had apparently been cascading from the shower for who knows how long. The shower itself was a standard fiberglass unit that probably dated back to the 1980s. I could see immediately that the problem wasn't just the shower head that was hanging at an awkward angle. "When did you first notice something was wrong?" I asked, kneeling down to examine the base of the shower where water had clearly been pooling. "About 3 weeks ago, the water pressure started getting weird. Sometimes it would be fine, sometimes it would barely trickle out. Then last week it started making this groaning sound like the pipes were complaining about something. This morning I turned it on and suddenly it was like a fountain exploded." I nodded, running my hands along the wall where the pipes were. "Hidden. Sounds like you've got a combination of problems." It's probably some mineral buildup in the fixtures. And I'm guessing there's a loose connection behind this wall that finally gave way. Is it going to be expensive? She asked, and I caught something in her voice that made me look up. There was worry there, the kind that suggested this wasn't just about the inconvenience. Let me take a proper look first, I said. No point in speculating until I know what we're dealing with. I spent the next 20 minutes examining everything I could see without tearing into the walls. The shower head was definitely shot, corroded beyond any reasonable repair. The faucet handles were loose, and when I tested the water pressure, it was clear that something in the plumbing behind the wall was causing problems. "Okay," I said, sitting back on my heels. "Here's what I'm seeing. You need a new shower head. Obviously, and I should replace those faucet handles while I'm at it. But the bigger issue is that there's probably a joint or connection behind this wall that's failing. I'll need to cut into the drywall to get to it, fix whatever's broken back there, then patch everything up." Sarah winced slightly. "How much are we talking about?" "Parts and labor, probably around 400, maybe 450, depending on what I find behind the wall. I can give you a written estimate if you want to think about it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mess of towels and water. "Now let's do it." "I can't keep living like this, and it's only going to get worse, right? Usually, yeah. Problems like this don't fix themselves. Story of my life," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that made me think she wasn't just talking about plumbing. I went back to my van to get the tools I'd need for the job. It was going to take most of the day, and I found myself oddly looking forward to it. There was something about Sarah that intrigued me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. She seemed like someone with stories to tell, the kind of person who'd lived enough life to have interesting perspectives on things. When I came back inside with my toolbox and a small reciprocating saw, Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee. "Want some?" she called out. "Fair warning, I make it strong enough to wake the dead." "Sounds perfect," I replied. "Fair warning. Back. This is going to be noisy and dusty for a while," I figured. "I work from home, so I'll probably set up in the living room with my laptop." "What do you do when you're not rescuing people from plumbing disasters?" I accepted the coffee mug she handed me. It was indeed strong enough to wake the dead, and it was exactly what I needed. This is pretty much it for me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've got Northwest Plumbing Solutions, which is really just me and my van and an answering service. Started it about 4 years ago when I moved here from Seattle. "What brought you to Riverside?" she asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Long story," I said, which was the polite way of saying I didn't really want to get into the details of my divorce, the business I'd lost, and the general life implosion that had led me to pack everything I owned into a U-Haul and drive until I found a place that felt like somewhere I could start over. "What about you? Riverside native?" "Born and raised, unfortunately," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "Well, not unfortunately. It's a good place to raise kids. Steady work, safe neighborhoods. Just sometimes feels like I've never been anywhere else. You know, kids?" I asked because the house felt like a family home, but I hadn't seen any evidence of children currently in residence. "One daughter, Emma. She's 22, just graduated from Portland State and moved to the city to conquer the world. Graphic design." There was pride in her voice, but also something else. "The particular brand of melancholy that comes with empty nest syndrome, maybe? That's great. Portland's got a good creative scene, so I hear. She's sharing an apartment with 3 other girls in some neighborhood I can't pronounce. Working at a design firm that probably pays her an experience in coffee, but she's happy, which is what matters." I finished my coffee and headed back upstairs to start the real work. Cutting into drywall is always a bit of a gamble because you never know exactly what you're going to find back there. But it's also oddly satisfying. There's something about making a controlled mess in service of fixing a bigger problem that appeals to the part of me that's always preferred concrete solutions to abstract ones. Sarah was right about the noise. The reciprocating saw made enough racket to wake the neighbors. But within 20 minutes, I had a neat rectangular hole cut into the wall behind the shower. And there, as I'd suspected, was the source of the problem. "Sarah," I called down the stairs. "You might want to see this." She appeared in the bathroom doorway a minute later, laptop still in her hands. Please tell me it's not as bad as your tone suggests. It's not terrible, I said, shining my flashlight into the wall cavity, but it's definitely the source. Of your water pressure issues? See this pipe joint here? It's been leaking for a while, which explains the low pressure. And this connection up here came completely loose, which is what caused your fountain this morning. She peered into the hole, careful not to get too close. Is that what I think it is? If you think it's mold, then yeah, probably. Too serious? Just surface stuff from the moisture, but I'll treat it while I'm in here. Great mold. Because my day wasn't complete without discovering I've been breathing fungus for months. I laughed. It's really not that bad. It's kind. A thing is more common than you'd think. Houses are just organized attempts to keep the weather out, and sometimes the weather wins a few battles. That's a surprisingly philosophical way to look at plumbing problems. For years of crawling around in people's basements and attics will make you philosophical about all kinds of things. She settled onto the edge of the bathtub, apparently deciding to watch me work rather than retreat to her laptop. Such as, I was elbowed deep in the wall cavity, trying to get a wrench positioned properly around a stubborn fitting, but I found myself enjoying the conversation, such as the fact that most problems people think are complicated are actually pretty simple. Once you understand what's really going on, most problems people think are simple turn out to have layers you didn't expect. Which category does my shower fall into? Honestly, simple problem, but it's been ignored long enough to develop. Layers. If you'd called the plumber 3 weeks ago when you first noticed the pressure issues, well, this would have been a 20-minute fix. Now, it's a day-long project. Story of my life, she said again, and this time I caught her eye. You keep saying that, she shrugged, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was debating whether to elaborate. A talent for letting small problems become big ones. Procrastination is probably too kind a word for it. I think I just convinced myself that things will get better on their own if I ignore them long enough. Does that ever work? Not even once, she admitted. But I keep trying anyway. Optimism or stupidity, depending on your perspective. I managed to get the old joint loose and started cleaning the threads so I could install a new fitting. What kind of work do you do from home? Freelance bookkeeping and tax preparation? Riveting stuff? I help small businesses keep track of their money and make sure they don't go to jail for tax evasion. It's not exactly what I dreamed of doing when I was 22, but it pays the bills and lets me work in my pajamas if I want to. What did you dream of doing when you were 22? She was quiet for a moment. I glanced over to see her staring out the small bathroom window at something I couldn't see. Travel writing, believe it or not. I was going to see the world and write about all the amazing places I discovered. I had this vision of myself sitting in cafes in Prague or wandering through markets in Morocco, sending articles back to magazines that would pay me just enough to keep moving. What happened? Life happened. I met my ex-husband during my senior year of college, got married 6 months after graduation, had Emma 2 years later. By the time I looked up from diapers and mortgage payments, I was 35 and travel writing felt like something I'd imagined rather than something I'd actually planned to do. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a kind of wistful acceptance that I recognized. It was the tone of someone who'd made peace with the gap between dreams and reality. Even if the peace wasn't entirely comfortable, it's not too late, I said, fitting the new joint into place. Travel writing's probably different now with blogs and social media, but people still do it. At 45. With a mortgage and a business and a life that's already established, I think that ship has sailed. Why? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Why? What? Why is 45 too late? You said Emma's moved out, so you don't have kids at home? You run your own business, so you control your schedule. What's actually stopping you besides the assumption that you're too old? She laughed, but it wasn't the same easy laugh from earlier. You make it sound simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe it just has layers you're not expecting. Could feel her looking at me. And when I glanced up from my work, there was something different in her expression. Not exactly hope, but something adjacent to it. Like she was testing the idea against her internal sense of what was possible. You know what the really pathetic part is? She said suddenly. I still buy travel magazines sometimes. Yeah, I tell myself. It's research for someday, but really I just like looking at the pictures and imagining what it would feel like to be somewhere completely different. That doesn't sound pathetic. It sounds like someone who hasn't given up on the dream, just postponed it. At 45, I still fantasize about being swept away, she said. And something in the way she said it made me stop what I was doing and really look at her. Not by a person necessarily, though that would be nice too. It's just swept away by something. Bigger than this house, this town, this routine I've built that feels safe, but doesn't feel alive anymore. The words hung in the air between us, more honest than I think either of us had expected. I could see that she was a little surprised by her own candor, but she didn't try to take it back or laugh it off. What would that look like? I asked. Quietly being swept away? She considered the question seriously. I don't know exactly. Maybe waking up in a place where I don't know what's around the next corner, where I have to figure things out as I go, instead of following the same patterns I've been following for 20 years, where I'm not just Sarah, the divorced bookkeeper, whose daughter moved away, but someone whose story is still being written. I understood exactly what she meant, probably better than she realized. Moving to Riverside had been my own attempt at being swept away, though I wasn't sure I'd ever articulated it quite like that. The work on Sarah's shower took longer than I'd anticipated, but not because of any complications with the plumbing. Every time I thought I was hitting a good rhythm, we'd fall into another conversation that made me forget I was supposed to be focused on pipe fittings and water pressure. By the time I'd replaced the faulty connections and started patching the drywall, it was well past noon, and Sarah had made us both sandwiches without asking if I wanted lunch. Turkey and Swiss, she said, appearing in the bathroom doorway with a plate. I hope that's okay. I realize I never asked if you had any food allergies or dietary restrictions. Perfect, I said, wiping my hands on my work shirt. You didn't have to do this. You've been here for 4 hours fixing my disaster. It's the least I can do. We sat on her back porch to eat, overlooking a yard that was clearly tended by someone who cared about growing things. There were late-season tomatoes still hanging. Heavy on their vines, a small herb garden that smelled like basil and rosemary. And flower beds that showed the kind of attention to detail that suggested gardening was more than just a hobby. This is beautiful, I said, gesturing toward the garden. Do you do all this yourself? Guilty, Sarah said, settling into a weathered patio chair that looked like it had hosted many similar lunches. It started as a way to save money on groceries when Emma was younger, but somewhere along the way it became my therapy. There's something about putting your hands in the dirt and watching things grow that keeps me sane. I could see what she meant. The garden had that lived-in quality that only comes from years of consistent care. But it wasn't perfectionist or showy. It was practical and beautiful at the same time, like someone had figured out how to make necessity look effortless. Long have you lived here? I asked. 15 years. Bought it right after my divorce was finalized. It was a mess back then, needed everything you could imagine. New roof, new furnace, floors that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. But the bones were good, and the price was right, and I needed somewhere that felt like mine. Sounds like a big project for someone going through a divorce. She took a bite of her sandwich and considered that. It was exactly what I needed, actually. Having something concrete to focus on, problems I could solve with enough time and effort, and YouTube tutorials. Plus, Emma was 14, so she needed stability more than she needed a perfect house. What happened with your marriage, if you don't mind me asking? I was prepared for her to deflect or change the subject, but she didn't seem bothered by the question. Michael and I got married young and grew into different people. By the time we figured that out, we'd been trying to force a relationship that didn't fit for about 5 years. The divorce was actually a relief for both of us, once we got past the logistics and the guilt. That's refreshingly mature. Don't give me too much credit. The first year after he moved out, I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I care to admit and cried during every single episode of whatever show I was binge-watching. Maturity came later, along with the realization that staying married to the wrong person doesn't actually help anyone. There was something about the way she talked about her past that I found compelling. She didn't romanticize it or make herself the victim, but she also didn't pretend it had been easy. It was just honest in a way that made me want to be equally honest with her. What about you? She asked. Ever been married? Once, briefly, in my late 20s, I paused, realizing I was about to share more than I usually did with clients. We met in Seattle, where I was working for a big plumbing contractor. Thought we wanted the same things, but it turned out we just wanted the same things to sound good when we talked about them. Meaning, she wanted the idea of being married to a guy who worked with his hands and came home tired but satisfied every day. I wanted the idea of being with someone who appreciated that kind of work and didn't think I should want something more impressive. But when it came down to actually living those ideas, they didn't fit as well as we thought they would. Sarah nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. The gap between the fantasy and the reality. Exactly. As I found out she'd been talking to her friends about me like I was a project she was working on. It's ways to get me to be more ambitious, more social, more whatever she thought I should be. It wasn't malicious, but it made me realize she'd fallen in love with who she thought I could become, not who I actually was. That must have been painful. It was, but it was also clarifying. The divorce, losing the house, having to start over from scratch, it all felt terrible at the time. But it also forced me to figure out what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I was supposed to want. And what did you figure out? I looked around her backyard at the evidence. Of 15 years of someone building a life deliberately and patiently, tried to put into words something I'd never really articulated before. That I like fixing things that are broken, that I'm good at it, and it makes me feel useful in a way that's hard to find. That I'd rather have a small business I control than a big job that controls me. That I don't need to live somewhere impressive. If I can live somewhere that feels right, Riverside feels right, it's starting to, I said. It's not realized as I said it that sitting on her back porch eating sandwiches and talking about failed marriages was contributing to that feeling in ways I hadn't expected. We finished eating, and I went back to work. On the shower, but the afternoon felt different than the morning had. Less like a professional service call, and more like spending time with someone I was genuinely curious about. Sarah continued working on her laptop downstairs. She'd check in periodically, sometimes with questions about what I was doing. Sometimes just to bring me water or see how much longer I thought it would take. Around 3 o'clock she appeared. In the bathroom doorway, with her phone in her hand and a frown on her face. "Everything okay?" I asked. "My sister," she said, holding up the phone like it was evidence of something. "She wants to know if I'm free for dinner tonight." Which sounds innocent enough, except Lisa never asks if I'm free for dinner unless she wants to talk to me about something I probably don't want to discuss, such as the fact that I've been divorced for 8 years and haven't been on a single date that lasted longer than coffee and awkward small talk, or the fact that I spend most weekends reading books and working in my garden instead of having what she considers a social life appropriate for a woman my age. I applied another layer of joint compound to the drywall patch and tried to keep my tone casual. Does she have suggestions for what a more appropriate social life would look like? Oh, she has many suggestions. There's apparently a divorced accountant at her church who's been asking about me. And her neighbor's brother just moved back to town after his own divorce and could probably use some company. And there's a hiking group for singles over 40. That meets every Saturday morning. Hiking group doesn't sound too terrible. It's not the activities, Sarah said, settling onto the edge of the bathtub again. It's the assumption that I must be lonely or incomplete or somehow failing at life because I'm not actively looking for a relationship. Lisa means well, but she can't seem to understand that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. Are you lonely? The question seemed to surprise her. Like she'd been so focused on defending her solitude that she hadn't actually examined whether she was satisfied with it. Sometimes, she admitted, but not in the way Lisa thinks. I don't wake up every morning wishing I had someone to make coffee for or someone to tell about my day. I wake up wishing I had something more interesting to tell. Like what? That I'd taken a pottery class or learned Italian or spent the weekend exploring some town I'd never been to before instead of reorganizing my closets and catching up on bookkeeping. I think what I'm really lonely for is a sense of adventure, not necessarily a person to share it with. I smoothed the joint compound with my putty knife and considered what she'd said. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, you know. Adventure and companionship, no. But they're both risks. I've gotten pretty comfortable with low-risk living over the past 8 years. What would high-risk living look like? She laughed. But there was something wistful in it. I have no idea. It's probably part of the problem. When Emma was younger, everything I did had to be filtered through what was best for her. What was practical? What was responsible? Which was fine. That's what being a parent means. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot how to want things. Just because I wanted them, not because they made sense or fit into some 5-year plan. So what do you want? Right now, if practical didn't matter, you're going to think this is crazy. Try me. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the bathroom window again. Want to learn how to tango. I saw this video online a few weeks ago of a couple dancing in Buenos Aires, just on the street with a guitar player, and it looked like the most beautiful, passionate thing I'd ever seen. I watched it probably 20 times, and every time I thought about how amazing it would feel to know how to do something like that. That doesn't sound crazy at all. It doesn't. Sarah, you're 45, not 95. Learning to tango is not some impossible dream. There are probably classes right here in Riverside. I know, she said quietly. I looked it up. There's a dance studio downtown that offers beginner classes on Thursday nights. I even drove by there last week and sat in my car for 10 minutes watching people go in and out. But you didn't go in. But I didn't go in, because what if I'm terrible at it? What if everyone else is younger or more coordinated or already knows how to dance? What if I make a fool of myself? I set down my putty knife and really looked at her. What if you're great at it? What if you love it? What if it's exactly the kind of thing you've been looking for? You really think it's that simple? I think most things are simpler than we make them. We just tell ourselves complicated stories about why we can't do the things we want to do. She seemed to be considering this, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece she was trying to fit into place. When's the last time you did something that scared you? The question caught me off guard because the honest answer was that I'd been avoiding things that scared me for the better part of 4 years. Moving to Riverside had been scary, but it had also been necessary. Since then, I'd been focused on building something stable and predictable, which was the opposite of scary. It's been a while, I admitted. See, it's not as simple as you make. It's sound, no, but it's not as impossible as you make it sound either. I finished the drywall patch and started cleaning up my tools while Sarah watched from the doorway. The repair was essentially complete. I just needed to let the joint compound dry overnight, and then I could come back the next day to sand it smooth and apply primer and paint. So I'll need to come back tomorrow to finish up, I said, packing my tools into their case. It's probably just a couple hours in the morning to get everything painted and put the new fixtures in place. That works for me, she said. Same time? Actually, I could come a little earlier if that's better for you. Say around 8? 8's perfect. I'm usually up by 6 anyway. I carried my tools downstairs and she followed, the house settling into the quiet that comes at the end of a workday. At the front door I paused, not quite ready to leave, but not sure why. Thanks for lunch, I said, and for the conversation. It's been a while since I've had a workday that felt more like hanging out with a friend. Thank you for listening, for making me think about things I've been avoiding thinking about, such as the fact that tango classes start at 7:30 on Thursday nights, and it's only Tuesday. I smiled. That gives you almost 48 hours to talk yourself out of it, or into it, or into it. We stood there for a moment, and I had the strangest sense that something had shifted between us over the course of the day. Not romantically, necessarily, though there was definitely an attraction I was trying not to examine too closely. But something deeper than that, like we'd accidentally stumbled into the kind of friendship that doesn't happen very often between people who've just met. I'll see you tomorrow morning, I said. See you tomorrow. I drove home thinking about tango, lessons in travel writing, and the way Sarah had looked when she talked about wanting to be swept away. There was something about her honesty that made me want to be more honest with myself about the things I'd been avoiding since my own life had fallen apart and I'd rebuilt it smaller and safer. My apartment was a studio above the hardware store, where I rented office space, furnished with the kind of practical furniture that served its purpose without making any particular statement about who I was or what I wanted. It was clean and functional and completely impersonal, which had felt like exactly what I needed when I'd first moved in. But sitting there that evening, eating leftover pizza and thinking about Sarah's garden and her travel magazines, and her admission that she fantasized about being swept away. I realized my apartment felt less like a home and more like a waiting room, like I'd been so focused on not making mistakes that I'd forgotten to make choices. I found myself wondering what she'd decided about dinner with her sister, whether she'd have to endure another well-meaning lecture about her social life and her need to put herself out there. I wondered if she was looking at those tango class schedules again, or if she'd already decided it was a ridiculous idea. Mostly I wondered what it said about my own life that spending a day fixing someone else's shower had been the most interesting day I'd had in months, and whether that was something I should be concerned about or something I should pay attention to. I arrived at Sarah's house the next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, my van loaded with primer, paint, and the new shower fixtures that would complete the job. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and I found myself looking forward to seeing her again in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation. Sarah answered the door in jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, holding a steaming mug of coffee that smelled like it could wake the dead from 3 blocks away. "Right on time," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I made extra coffee if you want some." "Please," I said, following her into the kitchen. "Did you survive dinner with your sister?" She laughed, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there the day before. Survived is probably the right word. Lisa means well, but she has this way of making suggestions that don't actually sound like suggestions. The divorced accountant? Among other things, apparently he's very nice and owns his own firm and would be perfect for someone like me who needs to start thinking about her future security. She handed me a mug and shook her head, as if I haven't been thinking about my own security for the past 8 years. I take it you weren't interested? I might have been. She'd presented it as there's this nice guy I think you'd enjoy meeting instead of you can't keep living like this forever. Sarah, it's amazing how quickly someone can make you feel defensive about choices you were perfectly happy with the day before. I could hear the frustration in her voice, and something else too. The kind of doubt that creeps in when someone you care about keeps questioning decisions you've made for yourself. "Did you tell her about the tango classes?" Sarah paused with her coffee mug halfway to her lips. "Actually, yes," which was probably a mistake. "Why?" "Because Lisa's response was to ask if I was having some kind of midlife crisis. Apparently wanting to learn to dance at 45 is a red flag that I'm trying to recapture my youth instead of accepting reality. What reality is that exactly? The reality where women my age should be focused on finding a stable relationship and planning for retirement, not fantasizing about passionate dances in foreign countries." I felt a flash of irritation on her behalf. "That's ridiculous." "Is it, though?" Sarah set down her mug and leaned against the counter. "Maybe Lisa's right. Maybe I am having some kind of crisis. Maybe wanting to be swept away is just another way of saying I'm not satisfied with the life I've built. Which is pretty ungrateful considering how many people would be happy to have what I have. Or maybe," I said carefully, "wanting to be swept away is just another way of saying you're ready for the next chapter." Before she could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Sarah frowned and moved to the window. "That's weird," she said. "I'm not expecting anyone." The doorbell rang, followed immediately by an impatient knocking that suggested whoever was outside wasn't planning to wait long for an answer. "Sarah, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Sarah's face went pale. "Oh no. Who is it?" "Michael, my ex-husband." She moved away from the window like she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I have no idea what he wants." The knocking continued, more insistent now. "Sarah, come on. It's important. Do you want me to leave?" I asked, though something about the urgency in the man's voice made me reluctant to go. "No," Sarah said quickly. "I mean, you don't have to. You're here to work, and this is probably just some issue with Emma or paperwork or something equally mundane." But she didn't look like she believed it was mundane, and when she opened the front door, I could see why. Michael was a tall man, in his late 40s, wearing an expensive-looking suit that suggested he'd come straight from some kind of business meeting, had the kind of restless energy that filled up a room, and the moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. "Sarah," he said, barely glancing at me before focusing entirely on her. "We have a problem." "Hello to you too, Michael. What kind of problem?" Emma called me last night. She's in some kind of trouble in Portland and she's not telling us everything. Sarah's posture shifted immediately. What kind of trouble? Is she hurt? She's fine, physically. But apparently she's gotten involved with some guy who's bad news. Now there's money missing from her account, and she's scared to go to the police. I saw Sarah's face go through several emotions at once. Fear, anger, the particular helplessness. That comes with having a child in danger who's too far away to protect. How much money? She asked. About $3,000? Her entire savings account? Plus she maxed out her credit card? $3,000? Sarah sank into the nearest chair. How did this happen? Who is this guy? Michael started, pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. She met him at some coffee shop near her apartment. Older guy, very charming, told her he was a photographer who could help her break into commercial design. Next thing she knows, he's convinced her to invest in some portfolio development package that was supposed to guarantee her work with major clients. And now he's disappeared, along with her money. She's ashamed to tell us the details. But from what I can piece together, she's been trying to handle this on her own for weeks. Sarah put her head in her hands. Why didn't she call me? Because you would have told her to be more careful, and she didn't want to hear it. Because she's 22 and thought she could fix it herself. Because she's scared and embarrassed and doesn't want to admit she made a mistake. The pain in Sarah's voice was obvious. We have to help her. Agreed. But Sarah, $3,000 isn't something either of us can just absorb right now. And if this guy is running some kind of scam, Emma might not be his only victim. Michael finally seemed to notice that I was still there, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway with my coffee mug and my tool bag, trying to figure out if I should make myself scarce. Sorry, he said, extending his hand. I'm Michael Mitchell, Sarah's ex-husband. Jake, I replied, shaking his hand. I'm just here finishing up some plumbing work. Michael nodded distractedly, but I caught him glancing between Sarah and me with a look I couldn't quite interpret, like he was calculating something. Sarah, we need to drive up to Portland today, he continued. Emma needs us there, and we need to figure out what our options are for getting her money back. Today? Sarah looked at me apologetically. Jake, I'm sorry, but can we postpone finishing the bathroom? This is obviously more important. Of course, I said immediately. Family comes first. The shower's functional as it is. The rest is just cosmetic. Actually, Michael said, and something in his tone made both Sarah and me look at him more carefully. Sarah, I think we should consider having Emma move back home for a while, till she gets back on her feet financially. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She just started her life in Portland. She has a job, an apartment, friends. She also has no money and poor judgment about men, apparently. Maybe she needs to come home where people who care about her can keep an eye on things. There was something about the way Michael said it that rubbed me the wrong way. The assumption that Sarah couldn't manage this situation on her own, the implication that Emma needed to be managed at all. She's not a teenager anymore, Michael, Sarah said quietly. She made a mistake, but that doesn't mean she needs to give up her independence. Independence? Michael's voice rose slightly. Sarah, she lost $3,000 to some con artist. That's not independence. That's naivety. Everyone makes mistakes when they're starting out. Not everyone makes $3,000 mistakes. I could see Sarah getting smaller with each exchange. Like Michael's certainty was wearing down her confidence in her own judgment. It was the same dynamic I'd witnessed countless times during my own marriage. The way one person's absolute conviction could make another person doubt everything they thought they knew. Look, I said, probably overstepping, but unable to stop. Myself, I don't know Emma, but maybe the question isn't whether she made a mistake. Maybe the question is how to help her recover from it without making her feel like she can't trust her own decisions. Michael looked at me like I'd suggested something absurd.
Oh.
I'm sorry, but this is a family matter.
You're right,
I said, setting down my coffee mug. Sarah, I'll pack up my tools and get out of your way. Call me when you want to finish the bathroom. But as I headed toward the stairs, I heard Sarah say something that stopped me cold. Michael, what if we're both wrong about what Emma needs? What do you mean? What if what she needs isn't to be rescued or managed or brought home where we can watch over her? What if what she needs is to know that we trust her to figure this out, with our support, but not our control? There was a long pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had a harder edge. Sarah, I understand that you've gotten used to making decisions on your own, but this affects both of us. Emma is our daughter, not just yours. I know that, do you? Because sometimes I think you've gotten so invested in proving you don't need anyone's help that you've forgotten there are people who want to help you. I was halfway up the stairs, but I could hear the shift in the conversation. It was no longer just about Emma and the money she'd lost. It was about something bigger and more complicated. That's not fair, Sarah said, isn't it? When's the last time you asked for help with anything? When's the last time you let anyone else have input on a decision that mattered? Maybe because every time I do, someone tells me I'm doing it wrong. Or maybe because you've convinced yourself that needing help is the same thing as being weak. I reached the bathroom and started packing my tools, but I couldn't help overhearing the conversation that continued downstairs. There was history in their voices, patterns of argument that had probably been repeated countless times during their marriage and apparently hadn't been resolved by their divorce. Sarah, I'm not trying to control you or Emma. I'm trying to be practical about a situation that requires action. And I'm trying to think about what's best for Emma in the long term, not just what makes us feel better right now. Sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes they're not. I heard footsteps on the stairs and busied myself with my tools, but Sarah appeared in the bathroom doorway a moment later, looking exhausted. I'm sorry about this, she said. Family drama wasn't part of what you signed up for. Don't apologize. Is Emma going to be okay? I think so. Hope. So, Michael's right that we need to go to Portland, but we need to go to support her, not to take over her life. That sounds like the right approach. Sarah leaned against the doorframe and rubbed her temples. Sometimes I think Michael and I got divorced, but never actually stopped being married. Still have the same arguments about the same things, just with more space between them. What kinds of things? Control versus trust. Safety versus independence. Whether wanting something different than what you have means you're ungrateful, or whether it means you're growing. She was talking about more than just their disagreement about Emma, and we both knew it. For what it's worth, I said, I think trusting people to figure things out is usually better than trying to protect them from making mistakes. Even when the mistakes are expensive, especially then, the expensive mistakes are the ones that teach you the most. Sarah smiled for the first time since Michael had arrived. You realize you're taking my side against someone you've never met. I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying that Emma sounds like she's trying to build a life for herself, and that's worth supporting even when it's messy. From downstairs, Michael called up Sarah. We should get going if we're going to beat the traffic. Sarah sighed. I should go. Will you be able to come back later this week to finish up? Whenever you're ready, just call me. She started to leave, then turned back. Jake, that thing we talked about yesterday, about doing things that scare you? Driving to Portland to deal with this situation without letting Michael take charge of everything? That scares me. Good, I said. That probably means it's exactly what you should do. After they left, I sat in my van in Sarah's driveway for a long time, thinking about the conversation I'd overheard and the way Sarah had looked when Michael questioned her judgment. There was something about their dynamic that reminded me uncomfortably of my own failed marriage, the way good intentions could become a form of control if you weren't careful. I thought about Emma, 22, and trying to make her way in the world, making the kind of mistake that felt catastrophic, but was really just expensive. I thought about Sarah, caught between wanting to protect her daughter and wanting to trust her to learn from her own experiences. Mostly I thought about the way Sarah had said that wanting to be swept away scared her, and how maybe that fear was exactly what she needed to pay attention to instead of avoid. I didn't hear from Sarah for 3 days. 3 days of wondering how things had gone in Portland, whether Emma was okay, whether the trip had somehow brought Sarah and Michael back together in ways that had nothing to do with their daughter's crisis. And I caught myself checking my phone more often than I should have. It's telling myself I was just concerned about a client while knowing it was more complicated than that. On Friday morning, my phone finally rang. Jake, Sarah's voice sounded different, strained in a way that made me immediately alert. "Sarah, how did things go? Is Emma all right?" "Emma's fine. Better than fine, actually. We got most of her money back, and she's handling everything really well. But Jake, I need to ask you something, and I'm not sure how to say it." "Just say it." There was a pause, and I could hear traffic in the background, like she was calling from her car. "Are you free this afternoon? I know it's short notice, and I know you probably have other jobs. But I really need to talk to someone who isn't family and who doesn't have opinions about what I should be doing with my life." Something in her tone told me this was about more than just needing to vent about family drama, of course. "Do you want to meet somewhere, or should I come to the house?" "Actually, could we meet somewhere else? Somewhere that doesn't have any history attached to it? There's a coffee shop downtown called the Daily Grind. It's quiet in the afternoons." "Perfect. Would 2 o'clock work? I'll be there." The Daily Grind was one of those comfortable, slightly worn coffee shops that felt like someone's living room, if someone's living room happened to serve excellent coffee and homemade pastries. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, away from the afternoon crowd of students and remote workers. Sarah walked in exactly at 2, but she looked different than she had earlier in the week. She'd made an effort with her appearance, but also more fragile somehow. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, dark blue with small flowers. And her hair was down instead of pulled back in her usual ponytail. "You look nice," I said as she sat down across from me. "Thank you." I felt like I needed to look like someone who has her life together, even if that's not exactly accurate at the moment. I went to get us both coffee, and when I returned, Sarah was staring out the window at the street like she was trying to organize her thoughts. "So Emma's really okay?" I asked, sitting down. "Emma's more than okay. She's amazing, actually. She'd already contacted the police before we even got to Portland. And she'd done her own investigation into this guy who scammed her. Turns out, he's been running the same con on young women all over the city, and Emma's information helped them track him down." "That's incredible." "It is. Michael and I got there expecting to find her falling apart, needing us to swoop in and fix everything. Instead, we found her angry and determined and completely capable of handling the situation herself." "How did Michael take that?" Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd sat down. "About as well as you'd expect. He kept trying to take over, talking to the police officer like Emma wasn't standing right there, making suggestions about what she should do next. Finally, she told him to stop treating her like a child who needed to be managed. Good for her. It was good for her. But it was also a wake-up call for both of us about how we've been parenting, even though she's not a child anymore." Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and took a sip before continuing. The drive home was interesting. Michael spent the first hour criticizing Emma's judgment, her choice to live in Portland, her decision not to call us immediately when the problem started. I spent the first hour defending her choices and reminding him that she'd actually handled the situation brilliantly. "Sounds like the same argument you were having at your house." Exactly the same argument, till we both realized we were arguing about our own fears, not about what was actually best for Emma. I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more to the story. "Michael's afraid that Emma's going to make the same mistakes he did when he was young. Big financial risks, trusting the wrong people, ending up in situations he couldn't control. I'm afraid that Emma's going to settle for safe choices and wake up in 20 years wondering what would have happened if she'd been braver." Those are pretty different fears. They are. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Michael said something that completely blindsided me. Sarah paused, looking down at her coffee like it contained the words she was looking for. He said that he'd been thinking about us, about our marriage and why it ended and whether we'd given up to Isley. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "What did you say?" I didn't know what to say. I mean, we've been divorced for 8 years. We've both built separate lives. The idea of going backward felt impossible. Did it feel impossible, or did it feel scary? She looked up at me sharply. "Why do you ask that?" "Because earlier this week, you were talking about fantasizing, about being swept away, about wanting something bigger than your current routine. And now your ex-husband is suggesting something that would definitely qualify as bigger." "It would qualify as bigger, but not necessarily as better. No, probably not. But it made you think about things you haven't been thinking about. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and I found myself holding my breath waiting for her response. It made me realize that I've been so focused on proving I don't need anyone that I haven't asked myself whether I want anyone. And do you? I don't know, maybe. But Jake, that's not why I asked you to meet me here. Why did you ask me to meet you here? She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Because of this. She handed me the paper. And when I unfolded it, I saw it was a registration form for the Thursday night tango classes at the dance studio downtown. It was filled out in Sarah's careful handwriting, but it wasn't signed. I filled this out last night, she said, after Michael dropped me off at home, and I was sitting in my kitchen trying to figure out how I felt about everything that had happened. The trip to Portland, Emma being so capable, Michael's suggestion about trying again, but you didn't turn it in. I didn't turn it in because I realized I was filling it out for the wrong reasons. Not because I genuinely wanted to learn to tango, but because I was trying to prove something to myself about being independent and adventurous. I handed the form back to her. What would be the right reasons? I have no idea. That's the problem. Sarah leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. Jake, I've spent the last 3 days thinking about our conversation about being swept away, and I think I've been approaching it all wrong. How so? I've been thinking about it like it's something that happens to you. Like you're just living your normal life and then suddenly some external force comes along and carries you off to a more interesting existence. But what if being swept away is actually something you choose? What do you mean? What if the reason I haven't been swept away is because I keep my feet so firmly planted that nothing could move me even if it tried? I considered this. You're talking about more than just tango classes. I'm talking about everything. The way I've organized my life so that everything is predictable and manageable and safe. The way I've convinced myself that wanting something different is the same thing as being ungrateful for what I have. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. No, they're not. But I've been treating them like they are for so long that I don't know how to tell the difference anymore. Sarah folded the registration form and put it back in her purse. Michael asked me to think about whether we should try counseling, see if there's something worth salvaging between us. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it. But Jake, the truth is, I don't want to salvage what we had. What we had was comfortable and predictable and ultimately unsatisfying for both of us. So what do you want? I want to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by what's safe or practical or expected. I want to make choices based on what excites me instead of what makes sense. I want to stop being afraid of making mistakes. She looked directly at me for the first time since she'd sat down. I want to be honest about the fact that our conversations this week have been the most interesting, challenging, thought-provoking exchanges I've had with anyone in years. I felt my heart rate increase, but I wasn't sure if it was excitement or anxiety. Sarah, I know this is complicated. I know you came to fix my shower, not to get involved in my family drama or my midlife crisis or whatever this is. But I also know that there's something between us that feels real and important and completely different from anything I've experienced before. There is, I admitted, but you're dealing with a lot right now. Your ex-husband, wanting to reconcile Emma's situation, figuring out what you want your life to look like. Maybe this isn't the best time to add another complication. Maybe it's exactly the right time. Maybe complications are what I've been avoiding, and maybe that's why my life has felt so static. Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, not asking you to fix anything or solve anything or make any promises about where this goes. I'm just asking if you want to find out what happens if we both stop being so careful. What would that look like? It would look like me signing up for those tango classes and asking if you want to come with me. It would look like being honest about the fact that I'm attracted to you and interested in you, and curious about what we might discover about each other if we gave ourselves permission to find out. I looked down at her hand, which was still touching mine, and realized that this was one of those moments where you have to choose between the safe path and the unknown path. And there's no way to know which choice you'll regret more. Sarah, what about Michael? What about him? What are you going to tell him? She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled with more confidence than I'd seen from her all week. I'm going to tell him that I've thought about it, and I don't want to go backward. I want to go forward, even if I don't know exactly what forward looks like. And if forward includes tango lessons and whatever this is between us, then it includes those things. Jake, I've spent 8 years making decisions based on what other people think I should want. I want to try making decisions based on what I actually want. What do you actually want? I want to finish this conversation at my house. I want you to complete the work on my bathroom, so that's one less thing left unfinished. I want to cook dinner for someone who makes me laugh and challenges the way I think about things. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer, but more certain. And I want to find out what happens when two people who've both been playing it safe decide to stop being so afraid of making mistakes. I realized I'd been holding my breath. That sounds like a plan. It sounds terrifying. Good terrifying. Or bad terrifying. Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. The best kind of terrifying. The kind that means you're finally doing something that matters. We left the coffee shop together, and as we walked toward our cars, I realized that everything had changed in the space of an hour. It's not just between Sarah and me, but in the way I thought about risk and safety and what it meant to live a life that felt worth living. So, Sarah said as we reached her car, dinner tonight? Say around 7? I'll bring the wine, and Jake, bring your appetite for complications. I have a feeling we're just getting started. 6 months later, I was back in Sarah's bathroom, but this time, I was installing a rain shower head she'd splurged on after her first freelance travel article got published in a regional magazine. The bathroom had become something of a symbol for both of us, the place where we'd first started talking honestly about what we wanted our lives to look like. How's it coming up there? Sarah called from downstairs, where she was packing for our weekend trip to Seattle. We'd made it a tradition to explore a new city together once a month, partly for her growing portfolio of travel writing, and partly a bit because we'd discovered that we both loved the feeling of being somewhere unfamiliar. Almost done, I called back, testing the water pressure. This new shower head is going to change your life. My life has already been changed. Thanks very much. I smiled, tightening the last connection. It was true. Both of our lives had been changed in ways neither of us had expected when I'd first walked into her house to fix a broken shower. The evening we'd had dinner together after our conversation at the coffee shop had been the beginning of something neither of us was quite known how to define, but both of us had been willing to explore. We'd spent hours talking about everything and nothing, cooking together in her kitchen, laughing about stories from our past relationships and our shared tendency to overthink simple decisions. When Michael had called later that week to ask for her answer about counseling, Sarah had been clear and kind but firm. She wasn't interested in revisiting their marriage, but she was grateful for the years they'd had together and the daughter they'd raised. Michael had been disappointed but not entirely surprised, and their relationship had settled into something more honest and less complicated than it had been in years. Emma had taken the news about her mother dating someone new, with the kind of pragmatic acceptance that 22-year-olds seem to specialize in. As long as he makes you happy and doesn't try to give me life advice, she'd said during one of our video calls. Also, I want to meet him, obviously. That meeting had happened 3 months ago when Emma had come home for a long weekend. I'd been nervous about it in a way that reminded me of being 16 and meeting a girlfriend's parents.
Ow.
But Emma had put me at ease within the first 5 minutes by asking detailed questions about the bathroom renovation and telling me horror stories about the plumbing in her Portland apartment. You know, she'd said later, when Sarah was out of earshot, I haven't seen my mom this relaxed in years. What we were doing was learning how to be together without losing ourselves in the process. It was messier and more complicated than either of us had expected, but it was also more rewarding. We'd figured out how to navigate the difference between Sarah's need for independence and my tendency to want to fix things. We'd learned to have arguments about real issues instead of dancing around them. We discovered that making up was even better when you'd fought about something that actually mattered. The tango classes had lasted exactly 4 weeks before we'd both admitted that we were terrible at it and didn't particularly care about getting better. But the experience of doing something completely outside our comfort zones together had taught us that we were good at encouraging each other to take risks, even small ones. Sarah's travel writing had started as a way to document our monthly adventures, but it had evolved into something more substantial. She'd sold pieces to 3 different magazines and was working on a longer article about small-town tourism in Oregon. More importantly, she'd started talking about bigger trips, international destinations that would require more planning and more courage. What do you think about Morocco? She'd asked the week before, showing me photos on her laptop of markets in Marrakesh and coastal towns that looked like something from a dream. I think Morocco sounds incredible, I'd replied. Also think you should go, whether I can come. With you or not? That had led to a long conversation about independence within relationships. About the difference between doing things together because you wanted to and doing things together because you felt like you had to. We'd concluded that the best adventures were the ones where you chose to include someone else, not the ones where you felt obligated to. My business had grown steadily over the past 6 months, partly through word of mouth and partly because Sarah had become my unofficial marketing manager, recommending me to anyone who mentioned needing home repairs. I'd hired Tony, a recent trade school graduate, to help with the larger jobs, and I was starting to think about expanding into general handyman services. You know, Sarah had said a few weeks earlier you could probably teach classes, basic home maintenance for people who don't know a wrench from a screwdriver. You think there's a market for that? I think there are a lot of people like me who spent years calling professionals for things. They could probably handle themselves if someone just showed them how. It was an idea I was still considering, along with several others that had emerged. From our conversations about what we wanted our futures to look like, the difference was that now I was making plans with someone else's dreams in mind as well as my own. And somehow that made the possibilities feel bigger rather than smaller. I finished installing the shower head and cleaned up my tools, then found Sarah in the bedroom folding clothes with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to pack efficiently through practice. All done, I announced. You now have the most luxurious shower in Riverside. Perfect timing, she said, holding up a sundress. Do you think this is too optimistic for Seattle in March? Definitely too optimistic, but pack it anyway. Might find somewhere warm to go for dinner. She folded the dress and added it to her suitcase, then turned to face me with an expression I'd learned to recognize. It was the look she got when she was about to say something important. Jake, I've been thinking about something. Should I be worried? I hope not. I've been thinking about the fact that we've been together for 6 months, and we've never really talked about what this is or where it's going. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Do we need to define it? Exactly. But I think I need to say something out loud that I've been thinking for a while. Okay. She sat down next to me, close enough that I could. Smelled the lavender soap she always used. I love you. It's not in the desperate, needy way I thought love was supposed to feel when I was younger, but in the way that makes me want to be a better version of myself. In the way that makes me excited about tomorrow because I get to share it with you. My heart did something complicated and wonderful. I love you too. In the way that makes me want to take risks, because I know you'll be there whether I succeed or fail spectacularly. Good, she said, leaning against my shoulder. I'm glad we cleared that up. Are you nervous about the Seattle trip? A little, but good nervous. It's the kind of nervous that means we're doing something that matters. We finished packing in comfortable silence, and later that evening we drove to the dance studio downtown. To watch the advanced tango class through the windows, it had become a ritual of ours, checking in on the thing we'd tried and abandoned. Reminding ourselves that not every risk had to be a success to be worthwhile. Do you ever regret not sticking with it? Sarah asked, as we watched couples glide across the floor with an elegance we'd never achieved. Not for a second, I replied. Do you? Not for a second. But I'm glad we tried. I'm glad we were brave enough to fail at something together. As we drove home, Sarah reached over and took my hand. Jake, yeah? Thank you for fixing my shower. Thank you for letting me. I mean it. If you hadn't shown up that day, I'd probably still be standing in a flooded bathroom, convincing myself that problems solve themselves if you ignore them long enough. And I'd probably still be living above a hardware store, fixing other people's problems while avoiding my own. We pulled into her driveway, and I realized that home had started to mean this house, this woman, this life we'd built together, without really planning it. It wasn't the life either of us had imagined 6 months ago, but it was better than anything we'd dared to hope for. Ready for our next adventure? Sarah asked, as we gathered our luggage from the trunk. "Ready," I said, and meant it. The next morning, we drove toward Seattle with a cooler full of road trip snacks, a playlist we'd compiled together, and no concrete plans beyond a hotel reservation and a list of neighborhoods we wanted to explore. Sarah had her camera and her notebook for the article she was writing. I had a guidebook and a willingness to get lost in a new city with someone I loved. "So what's next?" Sarah asked as we merged onto the highway. "After Seattle, after Morocco, after all these adventures we keep planning?" "I don't know," I said, reaching over to take her hand, "but I'm excited to find out." She squeezed my fingers and smiled. "Me too. I'm finally ready to be swept away. Even if it's messy and complicated and nothing like what you expected, especially then." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.